Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think everyone's kind of trickling in from the waiting room now. So thank you for joining us this morning. Obviously, we're here with John Warner from the Therapy Partners, talking about dealing with relationships both at home and at work. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Molly. I'm the event coordinator here at Kent and Victor Chamber. Quickly, just before I hand over to John, if I can just ask if you can keep your cameras on if possible, keep your microphones on mute, and use the chat functions for any questions, if you want to talk to each other or anything like that. It's all open there for all of you to use. So thank you very much. I will pass over to John.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. And because we've only got an hour, I won't ask everyone to introduce themselves and say anything about themselves, because that will probably take sort of 15-20 minutes to do that. So I'll just introduce myself and then say what I'm intending to do today. And if as we go along you have questions or you want to comment on anything I've said, there is a chat function on Zoom, so you can just put in there, and if I see any questions coming up, I'll attempt to answer them. So we've only got an hour, and so just to introduce myself, so I work as a couple and family therapist. So I see couples and families, and I've done a lot of training for Relate. I also do a lot of training for social services with child protection services, and I've got a private practice as well. So I trained with the Institute of Family Therapy well over 20 years ago now. So I've got a lot of clinical experience with all sorts of different kind of people, really, different client groups. So I really hope this meets your expectations, because what I'm planning to do today is just give you a taster of some of the principles, if you like, or some of the ideas that inform my practice. And I hope we'll just, encourage you to perhaps think a bit differently about relationships and about communication. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I really would like some of this will be a little bit interactive. So if people don't mind, keep yourselves on mute, but I might ask you some questions. It'd be great to have a bit of participation as we go along. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So I want to go right up to here. Oh, sorry, I've got to come out again because I've got to put audio on when I do this. Oh yeah, I've got that on now. Okay. So if you want to know more about Therapy Partners, there'll be information on about how you can get in contact with them. But listen, I started this with thinking about how this kind of sentence, because I really like this. It's from somebody called Pierce Barnett, or Barnett Pierce rather, who really did a lot of work around communication. And one of the things he said is, English is a language spoken by lots of people, many of whom don't speak the same language. And I think that really sums up for me the work I do, in the sense that when we communicate something to somebody, we have an intention behind what we're saying, but how it's actually received can be very different from our intention. So somebody's receiving it and then communicating back in a way that's not actually making sense of what we were saying, and then we respond in ways that then become where we both feel misunderstood, or people feel misunderstood. So I'm just going to give you an example of this, and I don't know if there's any way I can see you at the same time. I don't think so. Let me have a look. No, I'll just keep going anyway. So Sonia, so I just want you to imagine there's a couple who've just been to a movie at a local cinema, Sonia and Louis driving the car on the way home, and Sonia says, are you hungry? What do you think she might be asking or meaning here? And how do you think Louis might respond? So this is just to give you an example of how people don't always understand each other. What do you think she means when she says, are you hungry? I'm going to stop sharing because I can't actually see you, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. What do you think she might be meaning? Anybody? Oh, sorry, there's some chat coming up here. Fantastic, thank you. It's very strange talking online, isn't it? So, okay, so you're saying that you think she is meaning I'm hungry, and that she wants some dinner. So my question to you is, what stops her saying so? What stops her saying, look, I'm hungry?
Fear of irritating the driver.
Okay, that's one possibility. Any other possibilities as to why she might not say I'm hungry?
We're British. We're
You're
polite.
British. So there might be something about culture there and about being British and being polite. Any other thoughts? Yeah, he might think he has to pay for dinner. Absolutely. Any other thoughts as to why she doesn't just say, look, I'm hungry? No? Okay. Yeah, I'm tired and I just want to
It's
go home.
inappropriate for a lady to be hungry, I guess.
Say again, sorry? Can you say again? I missed that. Did someone say something about a woman's asking for her needs to be met? Well, I didn't catch what somebody said. Never mind. Let's just keep going, because I'm gonna. What do you think he says next then to when she says, "Are you hungry?" Anybody want to guess? I'll share my screen again. So what he says is no. So what does he mean by no? And how do you think she's going to respond next? So
Well, I think he's awfully jolly rude. If a lady tells him he's hungry, then he should consider her feelings and say,
but did she say she was hungry?
are you thirsty? Pull over.
She didn't say I'm hungry. She said, are you hungry? And he said no. I'm not.
Okay, I didn't listen.
No, it's fine. So she might be angry, absolutely, when he says no, but he may not be hungry, or as somebody earlier said, he may think, oh no, I've got to pay for the meal, or he might be thinking there's some football on TV and I really want to watch that. So anybody like to have a guess what she says next?
Well, being a woman of the 21st century, I'd say, well, actually, I am jolly hungry and I need feeding. Can we pull over and get a latte somewhere? But I'm quite bold.
Well, good. That's good. So maybe there's something around 21st century that enables you to do that. But maybe it may be, for example, in her family, that you don't put your needs out there. So that she's learned to not express her needs directly for all sorts of reasons. So let's just see what he says next. Whoops, hang on, I've got the wrong. Doesn't matter, we can use this. And she says, God, you're so selfish. So within nine words here, there's just literally 9 words to be spoken. It's full of possible meanings. You know, she says, are you hungry? He says, no. She says, God, you're so selfish. So when she said, are you hungry? She had all sorts of expectations. He said, no. And then she said, God, you're so selfish. We won't deconstruct the whole of this conversation, but it goes like this. And he says, what are you talking about? And she says, I'm hungry and you don't even care. And he says, of course I care. If you wanted to stop for dinner, why didn't you say so? And he says, I did say so. What? She says, I did say so. Why don't you listen better? And then he says, there's a good Italian restaurant up the road. I'll stop there. And she responds by saying, don't bother. I'm not hungry anymore. Take me home. And in many senses, this conversation's gone really, really quickly. So what somebody called Gregory Bates, and he's one of the sort of founding fathers of a systemic approach. I can say a bit more about what I mean by a systemic approach in a moment. He said, without context, words and actions have no meaning at all. So when we start looking at what they're communicating with one another, we really need to understand the context. And very often I'd say to you that when we're in communication with people, we're not really understanding their context any more than they're understanding our context. Often we're listening, or people are listening to respond rather than really trying to understand. Just to give you an example of what I mean without context words and actions have no meaning at all. So about 10 years ago, I was training for a marathon, and I was doing some training of this sort of thing in near what's the name of the place now? Doncaster. I was running back along a canal, so I'd done an 18-mile run on a very hot August day, and I was sunburnt and I was parched, and I just had my shorts and a sleeveless vest on, and yeah, I was really tired. And I was running back along this canal, and on the other side of the canal, I passed a sort of small foresty area where there was some young men shooting with an air rifle, and they shot up into the trees, and I saw a pigeon fly out. But as I ran past, one of them shot me in the back, and I was absolutely furious. So I stood on the edge of the bank shouting at them. I won't repeat what I shouted, but I was literally waving my fist, really angry. And they ran off. And just as they ran off, this older couple came up from an alleyway behind me, and all they saw was me on the edge of the bank, shouting and screaming, waving my fist at nothing, because the guys had already run off. So what do you think they're thinking? They were thinking, I could see from the way they were looking at me, they were thinking I was a bit odd. And then I said, they just shot me. And they looked over the other side, and there was nobody there. And there was a real sense in which, well, I could just tell from their faces and the way they hurried off down the bank of the canal that they thought I was a bit crazy. So they had no understanding of the context, and therefore they applied their own meaning to it, really. And we're all doing that all the time in all situations where we're applying our own meanings. Now, so I'm just going to show you this short video.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
So that's just an example, I think, of how we're hang on, let's move that on. So I think that just gives an example of how when people are in communication, whether that's at home or at work, it's often because we're not really understanding the context from which people are coming from. And very often when people are, what you will find, and what I find as a, in the work I do, and I'm sure all of you will be able to relate to this, is that people get stuck in patterns of communication. So when I see couples or when I see families, and I'll say something like, do you know what your partner's going to say next? Somebody will say yes, and do you know what she'll say when you've said that? Yes. Because and I relate to this myself too, we tend to get caught up in patterns of communication which become very, very predictable, where we're often left feeling misunderstood or not heard. And sometimes it feels like we're going around the same argument over and over again. And very often I think that part of the big problem there is that we're not really listening to understand. We're kind of listening to reply. And so people just get into conflict. I suppose it's worth me just saying as well that I think we all come from our families of origin, whatever our starts in life, where we have a different relationship to managing difference and conflict. So I've worked with some couples and some families where there's really loud arguing all the time, people really fight, to people who've been married for 30 years and they've never had one argument in the whole 30 years of a relationship. And or it's that kind of conflict gets, anything conflictual kind of gets swept under the carpet. So we all have a different kind of pattern of the way we go about managing difference. And a lot of the work I do is about helping people manage difference in more effective ways, really, because I actually think managing difference and conflict is really necessary for any relationship. And one of the things I think is also really important, it's true for me, it's true for all of you, is that when we're in relationship to somebody else, there are both the gains of being in relationship to someone else. So we're in a couple relationship or in a family relationship. There's also a tension sometimes, because we can lose our sense of separateness in the relationship. So this balance between being part of something and also being separate from it is part of what has to be worked out. And I can think of one couple I worked with who quite literally, apart from using the bathroom, would do everything together. And I can think of another married couple who lived in separate houses and would only meet 1 or 2 evenings a week. And it's not for me to say what's the right kind of relationship to have, but what I'm really interested in is how do you manage this tension between being 2 separate people as well as being part of a kind of couple relationship? So how can you be close and affectionate and connected without kind of losing your sense of self in that? Equally, how can you go off and do something separately without that being a threat to the relationship? So I'm talking about relationship, but I'm thinking family. So the reason I showed you that piece of video is really because when you watch a comedy series like that, or when you think about families, they're often caught up in these circular patterns of interaction, which become very predictable. And it's easy to kind of put the blame on one person and think about the problem being Jim shouting. But what tends to happen is that people have various beliefs about each other and various emotions about each other, and they behave towards each other, which then end up in circular patterns of interaction. I've seen literally hundreds of couples for couples therapy over the years, and I've only had one couple in all that time who've come in and said, I really want to think about how I'm impacting on this relationship and impacting on my partner. As you can probably imagine, the majority of people are wanting to blame their partner or say if their partner changed, then everything would be okay. The challenge, I think, of the work I do with people is really to recognize that the way we communicate may be inviting the very response we're complaining about. So let's just think of an example. If let's just say I'm complaining about my partner going out all the time and that she's not really committed to this relationship. And I'm angry about that, and I communicate that. That might inadvertently motivate her to go out even more, because why does she want to be around somebody who's angry and moaning? But the more she goes out, the more I complain. So we get caught up in these kind of circular patterns of interaction. And so when you look at that royal family video, I think Jim probably doesn't feel that powerful within the family, but the more he shouts, the more he feels marginalized and pushed out. The more he shouts, the more mum and the daughter kind of connect and align with each other on the settee, and the less powerful he feels, so the more he shouts. So I hope that gets across this idea of circularity, that very often the way we communicate invites a response back that actually just reinforces this circular pattern. So if you can imagine, my partner said to me, John, you never listen, and said that in an angry way. I could respond by being very defensive and getting angry and saying, of course I listen. Oh, by the way, we'll have some time for questions at the end of this. So I know that I'm just speaking and I'll carry on, but we'll have a time for a bit of question time. But I could respond by saying, I think you're right, sometimes I don't listen very well. What is it you'd like me to hear? And it creates a very different type of conversation. So a lot of what the work I'm doing, and a lot of what I'd encourage you to be thinking about in relationships is, how might your response invite the very thing back that you're complaining about, and how might you act wisely into the situation in order to create a different kind of conversation? Just as another example of this kind of circularity that I'm talking about, some years ago I was asked to see a woman in a psychiatric ward who'd made 3 serious attempts on her life whilst in hospital. And she was very, very depressed, and the nurses said that you won't meet a nicer, more optimistic, cheerful husband. And I met with them as a couple, and when they were sat down, I'd asked this woman a question, and she'd looked down at the ground, and she was clearly struggling to even be there, and I couldn't really hear what she was saying. She was kind of mumbling her answer, and this very kind husband would answer for her. What she's trying to say to you is, the effect of him doing that, however kindly intentioned it is, I would argue, makes it harder for her then to speak. And the harder it is for her to speak, so the more she feels the need to communicate something. And in families and in businesses as well, very often a third person gets caught up in conflict as well. So if you can imagine 2 people arguing, it may be that a third person presents as a problem. So the attention from 2 people arguing gets diverted through a third person, which happens in families with children a lot. So I'm just going to go back to sharing the screen again. So really what I want to encourage you to think about is a circular causality or linear versus circular causality. So you could think that John here, due to his childhood experience of rejection, has a fear of expressing his feelings, which leaves Mary feeling rejected and hurt. So she asks for a show of feelings, and because that is difficult for John, he avoids expressing his feelings, which leaves Mary feeling rejected and hurt. So I hope you can see how they're caught up in a kind of circular pattern of interaction there, where the more one does what they do, the more it's kind of inviting the response to start thinking in this circular way. How do you communicate that might be inviting the response that you don't particularly want? This is not to avoid individual responsibility, and that sometimes people in these circular patterns have a lot more power. So I've certainly, you know, I've worked with people where there's domestic violence, and somebody may actually be really violent in a relationship, and so it's not as though they're have equal power in a relationship, but it's just to draw you thinking about how our actions, our beliefs about somebody, our emotions and our actions are actually inviting a response, so that we start to think about how we might do things differently. Whoops. So just behind all the work I do is this belief that none of us see the world in the same way. You know, we could all, I don't know, I've done this with students before, where I've asked them to go out in pairs into a shopping centre or into town, and not to talk to each other, but come back 10 minutes later and share with each other what they saw, what they heard, what they perceived. And they have a conversation, and they saw and heard very, very different things, or made sense of things in a very different way. So all of us, when we have a situation, we immediately have thoughts about it. We also have certain moods and feelings towards it, and we also have sometimes a physical reaction to it, and we behave towards something based on really our past experience, our culture and our context. So, you know, I'm old enough now to remember when, for example, being gay was a mental illness and a crime. I can remember when I went to school that I was regularly beaten by teachers. What else? I mean, you know, my mum, when I sort of talked to her about some of her experiences, you know, had some memories of women used to talk a lot about women getting the vote and so on. There are a lot of things that we take for granted as normal now, which were not normal within a different culture and context. So it's constantly shifting and changing. We haven't got time to think about how that happens, but it is interesting to think about how realities get shifted and changed over time. So I'm just going to show you this next, just to illustrate what I'm trying to say about how much our experience and our culture and our context may actually prevent us seeing things. So this, some of you may have seen before, and just follow the instructions, and then we'll I'll say a bit more about it.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original.
Okay, so really what I'm trying to convey with that video is the fact that very often when we're in communication with other people, we're actually missing a lot because we're so determined to get our own point of view across that actually we're missing things in the communication. And I also think, and this is just to think about when we're speaking into a context or out of a context. You know, I work, part of my job is working in adult mental health, and the majority of people I work with have experienced trauma in childhood in some form or another, some form of abuse, or they've grown up in homes where there's a lot of violence, but they also have, a lot of them have very deep beliefs that they're failures. And so what's the kind of dominant story, if you like, about what it means to be successful, and where does that come from, and how do we measure ourselves against that, and how does that then affect our sense of self? So just to think about speaking or acting into and out of a context. So when I say something to somebody, I'm thinking about my own needs. It's based on my own experiences, my beliefs, kind of scripts I was given as a child. So, for example, my mother used to call me a happy, smiley one. So that was a kind of script I was given. And culture, all of these speaking into or out of a context. Now, these are incredibly powerful. Some of these stories we have about how to live our lives. So, men, for example, are 4 to 5 times more likely to take their own lives, often in violent ways. Women, I mean, I work with people who have anorexia, and 90% of them are female. Is that because it's a mental illness, or is it actually something about the messages women get about how they're supposed to look, and about a sense of it gives somebody a sense of control, or it's something where people feel they need to be in control. You know, men are more likely to use drugs and alcohol and so on. So these are the kind of cultures we grow up in. Really determine a lot of our beliefs and the way we speak into conversations. But when we're speaking, we're often not aware. We need to really try and understand where somebody else is coming from, and very often we're so determined to get our own point of view across that we're not really hearing where somebody else is coming from. So I guess really this is a lot about developing good listening skills. So just to say, and I won't say too much about this, but I think when you start thinking about gender, I've already mentioned some of the differences in terms of gender, but in terms of geography, race, religion, age, you know, I've just turned 60, and I'm very aware suddenly of some of the discourses around age and the stories around age and the language that goes with all these things as well. So, you know, you don't tend to get positive kind of language around getting older. Likewise with ability or disability, it's invalid or disabled, meaning you're not able, and so on. So a lot of language around a lot of these things is very, very powerful and shapes our sense of self. So again, in my job, I'm often thinking about what does the language mean, and how does it determine reality. So all of these things will all have different experiences of all of these. So certainly my experience growing up as a boy was that big boys don't cry, and that you had to suppress emotion. And I've even been in a bar actually once where some rugby team came in, and the guy said, "Look, my wife's just left me," and the guy next to him said, "Never mind, mate, have a pint," and that was the end of the conversation. And it's kind of like, well, you know, is that something around gender, or is that the way we're kind of taught, the way we're taught to think? So when we start thinking about conversations, whether it's in our families or at work or whatever, our extended families, or, you know, when we think about our sense of self, it cannot not be determined by our extended family. Whatever our families were like, they all have it has an impact on our sense of self. A script, you know, going back to that kind of idea of circularity, a script might be that I need to be a strict parent, that children need boundaries. And what tends to happen a lot in families is where if I take a position that I think my partner's too soft with the children, and I have beliefs about that children, you know, they need firm boundaries. They need to kind of get an internal sense of discipline. That if you're too soft, they'll grow up very dependent on you, and they won't form independence, and that, you know, they'll get away with murder. You know, so if I have that as a view, and those are my beliefs, and my partner has an opposite view, they might respond by taking a softer approach, and because they see all the shortfalls of being strict, so they might think being strict and boundaried is oppressive, and it's not going to allow children to become self-determining, or yeah, that they'll feel very oppressed. And what tends to happen when I was talking about that circularity earlier is that people polarize each other inadvertently. So the more you parent that way, the more I'll parent this way, and the more you parent that way, the more I parent this way. And this happens in all sorts of ways in life. So it might be that the more you're organized, the more untidy I become. The more untidy I am, the more organized you are. The more untidy I am. People are in reaction to one another. And then our early attachment experiences, you know, how safe we felt as children, how connected we felt, how loved and secure we felt. All these things, and culture and world events, you know, it's interesting how COVID-19 at the moment is having a massive impact on relationships, I think. You know, there's been a dramatic increase in calls to domestic violence helplines and so on. But all of these things create pattern. So they all impact on the way we think and feel and behave. And then each action, as I said earlier, is also a response, as it creates feedback, which in turn creates and maintains balance or equilibrium. So when I showed you the royal family earlier, you can kind of see how they're positioned in relation to one another, including Dave, who kind of acts as this go-between between the two parents, which is a pattern which you'll see over and over again. So behavior by one family member elicits responses from others, which they then respond to, and this is an unending cycle making for complex processes, which I call pattern. And my job, if you like, is to help people to stand back from that pattern and adopt a kind of space, if you like, where you can start to look at it and think, why are we doing this? What would happen if I did that? What sense do I make of why you behave in that way? So that actually people can then take responsibility for creating new patterns, which takes time, because I think very often these patterns are very well entrenched, but it's just by learning to do something different and repeat it over and over again, you can start to change the course of a relationship. So, and I think we're all culturally programmed to make assumptions about appearance, language, behavior, and its meaning. You know, advertising has a huge impact, I think, on our sense of self and the kind of relationships we have and our expectations. So, and you know, we can discuss this when we have some questions in a moment, but I also think notions of romantic love are organized incredibly powerfully to have sometimes unrealistic expectations of relationships. So yeah, this is just an example of what I mean by how advertising, how powerful it is. So just think about what the messages are here that it conveys about gender. And I mean male and female. It's mainly the female you'll see, but what's the story here?
Perfect.
No, sorry, could we just have a look at that one? Yeah.
Come on, you're right. Just a little bit more. Come on.
I'm gonna break it!
It doesn't just happen by magic. Behind every great Christmas, there's Mum. And behind Mum, there's Asta.
What's for tea, love?
So there you go. At the end of that, her partner says, "What's for tea, love?" Now that you whether that advert's supposed to be funny or not, I think it's giving very, very powerful messages about how you're supposed to be as a mum and how you're supposed to be as a wife, and that you do all the cooking and then you end up doing all the washing up, and you take a seat that's lower to everyone else at the table, and then you play with the children and you do all the shopping and you hoover and you do housework, and it's selling a kind of message, if you like, about how we're supposed to be. So I suppose a lot of my work as well is encouraging people to think about, where did you get the idea that you should be this kind of a person? Because they're very powerful messages. So a family script is a kind of shared expectation of how family roles are to be formed within various contexts. And a script might be, I mean, a script of a client I'm working with at the moment is that if you don't look after things, you don't deserve to have them. That's a message she got as a child. She's now got OCD, you know, and it's kind of like everything has to be kept perfect, because if it isn't, it's like you're a bad person, and it's very tied up with the kind of script she got as a child. So it's a kind of family motto, if you like. So I already mentioned my mother used to call me a happy, smiley one. That was a family script. It meant that, you know, my job was to kind of keep her happy all the time by smiling and not showing any anger or upset. So we get patterns from previous generations which we can either replicate because we think they've worked for us, or we try and correct them, or we try and improvise and come up with new scripts, new ideas about how to do family. And so I guess, again, part of my job is to think which ones are useful and which of the kind of stories you were told might be rewritten. And I think, yeah, no, sorry. So family life cycle, this is a complex picture, but don't worry about it. It's essentially to say that as we're moving through time as human beings, and there are certain predictable stresses, if you like I don't know, children leaving home, when my children, and that's that, as a parent, there's this balance between being protective and allowing your children to become more independent, which is something I work with a lot, because parents are often overly protective or underprotective. And how do you get that balance right? And when my children first went down to the shop, I kind of followed them and hid behind corners and behind hedges, making sure they were okay. It's that anxiety about letting go. So there are certain horizontal stresses. Children going to school, children leaving home, parents dying, getting old. These are kind of predictable. There are also unpredictable ones, like untimely deaths, you know, illnesses, accidents. The whole COVID-19 thing at the moment is unpredictable life stresses. How well we deal with them depends on also how, you know, how well attached we felt as children, how the messages we got from our families of origin about how to deal with problems, really, whether we turn to others for support or whether we feel we've got to cope with it all on our own. But it's also to do with these circles, also in terms of the messages we get about gender and class and race and all the things I talked about. Okay, I don't think there's too many more slides, so then we'll stop for some questions. And I'm sure, sorry, this is a real rapid tour through. It's just a brief summary of some ideas that I work with in the work that I do. But it's this idea of first or second order change. So if I say to somebody, look, if you don't do this, I don't know, in social services, it might be, if you don't do this, I'm going to take your children into care, or if you don't do this, you know, we'll have to think about your job, or if you don't do this, I'm taking your pocket money away, whatever it is. Somebody may make that change at the level of behavior. So somebody might do something different. The work I do, I think, is about trying to bring about second order change. So that's change at the level of belief. You know, why it's really helping people to start to think differently. And so a lot of the work I'm doing, so we went back to the couple John and Mary, where John withdraws and Mary feels rejected. I'd be working with them really around their beliefs around that, and help them to think about how they're organizing one another. So change at the level of belief is more likely to be a sustained kind of change. And so I think this is a useful formula for change. It's a commitment to experimenting with difference. So like, just in terms of, for example, one of the things I have a lot in my work is parents who get into these really difficult relationships with teenagers, where the teenagers wanting more and more independence, often getting quite bolshy, often getting quite angry, and the parent feels they're losing all their authority, so they shout and get angry, and it becomes like a shouting match, and the parent feels they're losing more and more power. Now, one of the stories I sometimes share is that when my son was younger, I remember I went home one day from work and he was watching telly, and I said, hi there, Ben, and he said something quite rude to me. Now, if that had been me as a child, I know exactly what would have happened. The TV would have gone off. I'd have probably got slapping, and I'd have gone upstairs and there'd have been a scene. All I had to do was look at him and say, Ben, and then walk out the room. And within a few minutes, he was out there saying, Dad, I'm really sorry. So in a sense, it's kind of like using, in a sense, one of the things, we haven't got enough time to think about this now, but I think one of the things I say to parents is, look, you're not 100% responsible for children, are as much responsible for the relationship as you are. So if we can experiment with action, doing something differently and repeat it over time, it can make a kind of difference to the patterns of relationships that we have with people. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and that will give us about 10 minutes if anybody wants, if we can have a discussion. I hope this is oh, you're all still there, great, because sometimes when you're talking to a screen you don't know if anyone's there or not. So okay, so I just wondered whether people had any questions or any comments on what I've been speaking about. So you can either put that in chat or feel brave and unmute and ask a question.
I just wanted to say, if I can quickly, I'm stubborn as anything. That's given me so much to think about. Thank you.
Who's that speaking? Is that Sally? Sorry, was that you, Sally, or?
That was me, Molly.
Oh, sorry, Molly. What did you say?
Just that I'm as stubborn as anything. So that's really given me a lot to think about. So I just wanted to say thank you.